Have you ever read a verse in the Bible and felt like there was something hidden there, like an echo of an untold story? There's a line in Genesis that has been hauntingly silent for centuries. Cain knew his wife. But where did she come from? If Adam and Eve were the first, if Cain and Abel were the only children, how could this woman just appear? This question seems small, but it carries the weight of an ancient mystery, a silence that is not a failure, but a choice. Because not everything that matters has been written, and not everything that has been lived has been named. There are entire lives between the lines of the scriptures. Forgotten women, unmentioned children, stories buried under the urgency of revelation. This video won't just tell you where Cain's wife came from. It will show you how the Bible holds its greatest secrets, in the details that many ignore. Stay until the end, because there are truths that don't shout, but wait for those who have the courage to listen to what the silence is saying. There are details that go unnoticed in the first readings, but when noticed, they provoke a special kind of uneasiness. An isolated verse, a brief phrase, a gap in the text that insists on not explaining itself. This was the case for many people when they came across the following passage from the book of Genesis. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. A short, seemingly simple passage, but one that raises an inevitable question. If Adam and Eve were the first human beings created by God, and their children were, up until that moment, only Cain and Abel, where did this aforementioned wife come from? How could there have been someone available to unite with Cain if, supposedly, no one else existed? The answer, as straightforward as it may seem, escapes the surface. It requires more than a literal reading or an attachment to a strict chronology. It requires openness to perceive that the biblical text, in addition to what it reveals, also preserves what it chooses not to tell. And what is not told says as much as what is written. The name of Cain's wife is not mentioned, nor is her origin, but the fact that she is there, present in one of the first generations of humanity, already indicates that there were more lives in progress than the text cares to narrate. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and ordinary readers have sought to understand this absence. Some have seen contradictions, others have seen signs of a selective narrative project, focused more on spiritual lineage than on describing a complete genealogy. Still others see this omission as an invitation to investigation, a kind of literary provocation that demands more from the reader than passive acceptance. Because it is not just a matter of knowing who Cain's wife was. It is a matter of understanding how the first stories of humanity were organized, what was preserved, what was forgotten, and what was left between the lines. At a time when everything seemed new, when the days had no history and the newly created soil had barely witnessed the first human steps, life was already multiplying intensely. According to the biblical narrative, Adam lived for more than 900 years. This detail, far from being merely symbolic, points to a population growth dynamic very different from what we know today. With long lives and the divine blessing to bear fruit and multiply, it is reasonable to think that countless sons and daughters were born, even if their names are lost in the silence of the text. The Bible, as a literary and spiritual construction, does not aim to present an encyclopedia of all the people who ever lived. Its focus is on revelation, on the covenant, on the journey of faith. This means that characters may appear without formal introduction, and others, even those essential to the continuity of humanity, remain anonymous. Cain's wife represents this type of presence. She is there, existing in the structure of the story, but absent from the center of the narrative. Her role is fundamental, but her story has been for some reason silenced. This silence becomes even more intriguing when we realize that the same thing happens with the daughters of Adam and Eve. The text states that they existed, but it does not say how many there were, what their lives were, or what names they were given. This absence does not diminish their importance, but rather reveals a striking characteristic of ancient texts, the centrality of men in genealogies and in the transmission of history. Even so, It is impossible to talk about the propagation of life without considering these figures who, even without a recorded voice, were the true continuators of existence. The presence of nameless women and characters who appear seemingly out of nowhere shows that the biblical universe is much broader than its records. There is a layer of humanity that is not described but essential. And it is from this perception that the question about Cain's wife becomes more than a genealogical doubt. She becomes a symbol of everything that has been forgotten, erased, or simply not recorded. In modern times, where memory and recognition of previously marginalized figures are valued, looking at these gaps can be an act of narrative justice. Thus, what begins as a curiosity gains substance and depth. The question about Cain's wife, as old as the text itself, unfolds into reflections on structure, choices, and silences. It is no longer just about searching for a name, but about listening to what its absence has to teach us. Because in the silence of these pages, stories are hidden that we may never know in full, but that form the basis of everything that came after. Throughout the first chapters of Genesis, it is clear that the Bible constructs an intentionally concise narrative. It does not set out to record every birth, nor to map the history of each member of the original family. Its main focus is on specific lines, such as the one that would lead to Noah, then to Abraham, and centuries later to Jesus. However, the text does not deny the existence of other descendants. On the contrary, there are specific mentions that indicate a growing population, although not named. According to Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, Adam lived 800 years after the birth of Seth, and during that time he had sons and daughters. It does not say how many or who they were. It only states that they existed. This passage, although brief, is fundamental to understanding the expansion of humanity in its most primitive phase. If we take into account the extremely long life expectancy attributed to the first patriarchs and consider a continuous rate of reproduction over centuries, the number of descendants of Adam and Eve would quickly become significant. It is not possible to define precisely how many years passed between the creation of the first humans and the episodes narrated in the following chapters. However, the data provided by the Bible itself allows for reasonable estimates. For example, Adam would have lived for 930 years in total. Seth, his third mentioned son, would have been born when Adam was 130 years old. Between this birth and Adam's death, 800 years passed. Even with margins of error or symbolic interpretations, the time involved is long enough to allow for the emergence of multiple generations. In this context, the idea that Cain found a wife among his sisters or nieces is not only plausible, it becomes almost inevitable. There was no other human group identified in the biblical text. Any alternative would require a parallel creation, which is not suggested by the book of Genesis. The most straightforward reading, consistent with the rest of the text, is that Cain married someone from Adam and Eve's own lineage, even if that person is ignored in the written record. It is important to remember that, at that time, records did not follow the modern model of inclusion and detail. The ancient world operated under different criteria. The predominant patriarchal culture prioritized the citation of male names in genealogies, especially those considered responsible for the continuation of the divine promise. This meant that women and children who were not directly involved in the spiritual covenants were often not mentioned. This practice, although common in ancient records, contributes to the gaps seen today. Still, the narrative's internal data indicate that there was enough population for the beginning of the formation of social nuclei. When Cain fears being killed by others when punished by God, the inevitable question resurfaces: who would these others be? The most coherent answer continues to be the existence of siblings, nephews and nieces who were born after Abel's murder. Cain's own concern presupposes that the population was no longer limited to the immediate nucleus of his parents. The emergence of the city of Enoch, mentioned in Genesis chapter 4, also reinforces this idea. Cain, after leaving the divine presence, establishes a community and names the city after his son. The concept of a city presupposes a minimal structure of people, organization, and joint activities. This suggests that humanity, even in its early stages, was already advancing towards more complex forms of coexistence, going beyond the original family. The absence of female names in the initial biblical accounts can therefore be understood as a narrative and cultural choice, not as a denial of their existence. They were there. They had children, built families, and participated in the formation of the first human groups. They were fundamental, although the sacred text chose not to record their stories. This silence, rather than erasing them, highlights how much their lives were structuring for everything that came after. Over time, this pattern repeats itself. Decisive female figures appear and disappear behind the scenes of the records. The Bible sometimes acknowledges their importance, but still prioritizes other elements in the narrative. The continuity of life, however, depended directly on these women. They were daughters of Adam and Eve, mothers of the next generation, and pioneers in the care, organization, and education of the first children born outside of Eden. In this context, the history of humanity takes on broader contours. Forgotten figures, omitted names, and silent faces do not diminish the impact of the narrative. On the contrary, they increase its complexity and invite reflection on what is remembered and what is left in the margins. Because what is absent on paper was not always absent in reality, and understanding this is essential to seeing ancestry as a whole, with all its layers, voices, and silences. The growth of humanity, although silent in the opening pages, reveals its marks with intensity when human behavior begins to collide with the limits of obedience. Among the direct descendants of Adam and Eve, an episode becomes the landmark of the first recorded moral conflict, the murder committed by Cain against his brother Abel. This act, more than a disagreement between family members, inaugurates the presence of deliberate evil in human history. It shows that error no longer comes only from a failure to comply with God, as occurred in Eden, but also from the conscious choice to hurt another. Cain and Abel, sons born after the expulsion from the garden, are presented succinctly, but with clearly defined roles. Cain works the land, Abel tends flocks. Both offer God the products of their labor. However, God's acceptance falls only on Abel's offering, without the text explaining the criteria precisely. This choice provokes an immediate reaction of frustration in Cain. The Bible describes his fallen countenance, revealing that, even before the crime, there was already an internal disturbance that consumed him. The rejection of the offering, more than a material disapproval, seems to expose something deeper: the condition of the heart of the one who offers. Although the text does not elaborate on all the reasons for the refusal, it is possible to perceive that the intention, the form, and the delivery have weight in the relationship with the divine. Cain's gesture, although outwardly correct, lacked something essential: sincerity of spirit. God realizes this and warns Cain. The warning is direct, almost paternal. If he acts correctly, he will be accepted. If not, sin is lurking, ready to dominate. This image of evil as something that prowls, that waits, is symbolic and current. It presents error not as an abstract force, but as an active presence, with a desire to influence. Even after being warned, Cain does not change his attitude. He takes his brother to the field and there commits the first murder of humanity. This moment marks the definitive rupture of the initial innocence. The soil, previously cultivated by his hands, now becomes an accomplice to the blood spilled. The land, which should sustain life, becomes a symbol of loss. Cain's crime was not only against Abel, but against the structure of human coexistence. He killed a brother, but he also attacked trust, justice, and the hope of continuity without violence. The divine response comes once again with questions. God, who had already questioned Adam and Eve in Eden, now turns to Cain. Where is your brother? The question is not intended to obtain information, but to provoke awareness. Cain responds with irony and coldness. I don't know. Am I responsible for him? This denial of responsibility reinforces the gravity of the act. The error was not only in taking the life of another, but in trying to free oneself from any duty in the face of the suffering of others. God then declares that Abel's blood cries out from the earth, as if creation could not remain silent in the face of injustice. The punishment is set. Cain will not die, but he will be cast out. The land that once provided him with sustenance will become barren for him. His identity as a farmer will be eroded. He will become a wanderer, someone without a fixed place, without territory, without security. The punishment is not death, but exile, and the rupture with what gave him identity. Cain reacts with despair. He believes that his punishment is too heavy. He fears that others will kill him, even without knowing who these possible aggressors might be. This statement indicates again that the world was no longer made up of just 4 people. There were other lives in circulation. People born in previous decades, brothers, nephews, cousins. Cain knew that his actions would have repercussions within this larger group. If this content is making sense to you, write Amen in the comments. It's a way of showing that you're on this journey with us and giving strength so that more people can get here too. Even in the face of the gravity of the act, God sets a limit to revenge. He places a sign on Cain as a form of protection. It is not known what this sign was. The text remains intentionally vague. What matters is the gesture. The aggressor was punished, but he was not handed over to the violence of others. There was justice, but also a kind of mercy. The murderer was condemned to isolation, but not to destruction. Soon after, the text mentions that Cain knew his wife and that Enoch was born to her. This brief sentence raises one of the most debated questions in biblical history. If Adam and Eve were the first, if Cain was one of the first sons, how could there have been someone available to become his mate? This passage, although short, breaks the reader's expectations. It insinuates that history followed its course, that life continued, that descendants were born, even if their names were not recorded. This is where the enigma arises. Cain's wife, silent in the narrative, carries within her the proof that the records are selective. She is not introduced, her origins are not described, but she is a mother, a wife, and an active participant in the formation of the following generations. Her presence, even if not explained, confirms what the previous text already suggested. Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters, although only a few are directly mentioned. This enigma is less a problem than an invitation to read carefully. It points to the biblical author's choices, to the focus on the spiritual line that leads to certain characters, and not to the entire existing population. Cain's wife thus represents not just an isolated figure, but an entire segment of humanity that lived, built, and generated, even without being named. An invisible but inevitable presence. A reminder that there is more history between the lines than in the verses stated. The silent presence of Cain's wife reveals more than just the omission of names. It shows that the biblical text, from its first chapters, chooses to build the story based on central characters, while many others remain merely suggested. The lack of details does not mean an absence of reality, but rather a narrative focus. Even so, over the centuries, this lack of information has opened space for other approaches that have attempted to fill the gaps left by the scriptures. Among the oldest records that attempted to complement Genesis, the Book of Jubilees stands out. Although not recognized as part of the canon by the broader Jewish and Christian traditions, this text is one of the best-known works among the so-called apocryphal books. It gives names to female figures ignored by the official narrative, among them Awan, presented as Cain's sister and wife, and Azura, mentioned as Seth's companion. The attribution of these names is not limited to a creative exercise. It is an ancient attempt to outline what the written tradition left aside. These alternative sources do not arise by chance. They reflect the natural discomfort of those who read and notice the blank spaces. When the Bible states that Adam had sons and daughters, but does not bother to name even one woman from that generation, questions inevitably arise. After all, how could the world have been populated without their contribution? How could families have formed if there were no women? Even without the precision of the details, there is one inevitable observation. Women have played an essential role in the growth of humanity since its beginnings. The fact that their names are not recorded does not erase their importance. In every birth, in every generation, in every embryonic social structure, there were mothers, wives, caregivers, organizers. They were the ones who supported the foundation of what would become human civilization, even though the biblical text focused mainly on male names linked to spiritual lineage. Some more recent interpretative currents, attempting to reconcile the data in the Bible with archaeological and anthropological discoveries, have even suggested that there may have been other human groups outside of Adam's direct descendants. This idea, known in some discussions as the multiple creation hypothesis, does not find explicit support in the scriptures, but emerged as a way of dealing with scientific evidence that points to human populations in different regions of the world long before the period traditionally attributed to Genesis. Archaeological sites, such as those found at Jebel Irhoud in present-day Morocco, provide evidence of human presence dating back 300,000 years. These discoveries challenge the traditional chronology established by a literal reading of the Bible, which would place the creation of the first man a few thousand years ago. This conflict between scientific data and the biblical narrative has prompted theologians, historians, and scientists to seek broader interpretations. Some suggest that Adam and Eve may not have been the first human beings in biological terms, but rather the first with spiritual consciousness, the first with whom God established a direct relationship. Even though such theories are not universally accepted, they demonstrate an effort to broaden our view of ancient texts. They seek to understand how civilizations actually emerged and how Genesis may have been constructed as a symbolic representation of profound spiritual truths, rather than a literal record of historical events. Within this broader context, the silence about the daughters of Adam and Eve takes on new meaning. They not only existed, but represented a vital link between the original creation and the multiplication of peoples. Without them, there would be no continuity. Without them, there would be no social, emotional, or family structure. Even without names, their presence sustains the entire narrative that unfolds from the union of Cain and his wife, the birth of Enoch, and the formation of the first cities. This look at what is unsaid, at what is left off paper, invites us to reflect on how collective memories are constructed. Who chooses what will be told? Which names span the centuries, and which remain on the margins? By turning our attention to these forgotten women, it is not just about claiming space for ignored characters, but also about recognizing the essential role of those who sustained life while others created records. The sacred narrative is also the story of those who were not remembered. And it is in these anonymous faces that we find a profound part of the origin of humanity. The emergence of multiple generations from the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve not only resulted in the numerical expansion of humanity, but also in the emergence of different spiritual trajectories. Amid the multiplication of families and the formation of the first communities, opposing positions regarding the sacred began to emerge. And it was from two direct descendants that these differences took on symbolic form, Cain and Seth. Both were born into the same environment, heirs to the same origin, but they walked in directions that would express, over time, two distinct understandings of life and God. While Cain distances himself from the spiritual center and builds his descendants based on strength, conquest, and the founding of cities, Seth represents a resumption of the covenant, a reunion with reverence, humility, and the call to communion with the Creator. After the death of Abel and the departure of Cain, the biblical narrative presents Seth as a divine response. When Eve mentions the birth of this new son, she does so with words that express more than gratitude. There is an understanding in them that Seth was not just another child, but someone who would restore a broken continuity. Seth's lineage, different from that of his brother, comes to be presented as that through which spirituality, worship, and hope would be preserved. One detail that helps us understand the difference between these two lineages is the name of one of their descendants. Enos, Adam's grandson through Seth, is mentioned as the man in whose time people began to invoke the name of the Lord. This phrase reveals something fundamental. Spirituality, which until then had been dispersed, began to take on a collective form. Worship ceased to be just an individual act and became a broader movement of devotion rooted in the awareness of a common need to turn to the divine. When observing Cain's lineage, we notice another type of legacy. His descendants are described as founders of cultural and technical practices. Among them are musicians, toolmakers, and creators of urban activities. This is not to condemn these advances, but to realize that this genealogical line is more focused on the material and social domain than on spiritual interiority. The city founded by Cain, for example, and named after his son Enoch, shows the desire to put down roots in a land from which he had been removed, an attempt to rebuild identity through work, not reconciliation. Meanwhile, the descendants of Seth are dedicated to preserving an invisible heritage. They do not appear as city builders or inventors of instruments. Their mark is on the continuity of faith. And it is precisely along this path that, in time, we will reach figures such as Noah, Abraham, David, and finally Jesus. The path traced from Seth onwards is not the most obvious, nor the most celebrated in the first chapters, but it is in it that the promise of redemption rests. This contrast between the two lineages goes beyond the character's biography. It begins to represent human choices. Cain and Seth become archetypal symbols. On one side, there is the one who chooses to live on the margins, to build with his own hands, to establish his strength in the world, but without repairing the spiritual rupture. On the other, there is the one who assumes the continuity of the alliance, who recognizes its fragility, and who decides to walk under the guidance of the sacred. This duality continues to be reflected in each generation. In times of rapid decisions and fragmented values, the difference between the paths of Cain and Seth remains like a mirror. It is not about condemning those who build or praising those who renounce, but about understanding the basis that sustains each action. What guides our steps? Pride or obedience, forgetting the other, or recognizing our interdependence? It is also possible to note that the consequences of these choices are not limited to the individual. They unfold in their descendants, in their communities, in everything they touch. The lineage of Cain leads to the emergence of Lamech, a character who elevates pride to the point of boasting of his violent acts. The lineage of Seth leads to men like Enoch, described as someone who walked with God to such an extent that he was taken without seeing death. These contrasts show that choices accumulate, that the paths taken by ancestors shape the horizons of their children. The biblical text, by highlighting these two lines, is not merely reporting ancient facts, it is pointing to recurring structures of human experience. Each person, in his or her own way, is called to define his or her path, to decide whether to follow the shortcuts of unlimited autonomy or the path of attentive listening to what is eternal. Cain and Seth were not merely brothers. They were landmarks of possibilities. From the earliest days of humanity, they represented the conflict between separation and return, between wounded pride and restored hope. And this tension remains present, silently, in every choice made to this day. Over the centuries, the stories recorded in the first chapters of the Bible have remained the foundations on which profound questions about humanity are based. Not only about origin and destiny, but also about responsibility, choices, and memory. Throughout this journey, it becomes clear that the biblical narrative does not seek to present a complete chronicle of the life of every human being who has ever existed. It presents a structure focused on revelation, building its narrative axis with central characters and silencing by literary or cultural choice figures who were equally essential. It is in this silence that we find the daughters of Adam and Eve, the wife of Cain, and so many other people who, despite not being named, sustained the continuity of human existence. The absence of their names does not erase the relevance of their actions. On the contrary, it makes even more evident how much the choices of those who write also shape what is remembered and what is forgotten. Tradition, by prioritizing certain figures, ends up revealing what has often been left on the margins of memory. Cain's path, marked by distance, pain, and exile, contrasts with that of Seth, who represents the reconnection with the sacred. There are two possible paths, two ways of responding to losses, injustices, and that which cannot be undone. The lineage of one builds cities, creates instruments, innovates in human endeavor. The lineage of the other preserves contact with the divine presence, sustains the bond with that which is eternal, even without visible glory. What remains as a legacy is not just the succession of names, but the meaning that each lineage carries. Those who walk in the direction of restoration create spaces where life can flourish with purpose. Those who follow the path of rupture build structures, but find no rest. This does not refer to a simplistic judgment between right and wrong, but to a broader vision of the kind of story one wants to write with one's own life. Even in the briefest verses, such as the one that states that Cain knew his wife, there is a whole universe of implications. The brevity of the sentence does not diminish its density. It invites us to look at what is not said, to realize that sacred history is composed of many layers, and that not all of them are visible at first reading. What is not indicated often carries greater weight than what is. When we reflect on these characters, on those who were remembered and those who remained in the shadows, we are called to listen more deeply. Because in every forgotten name, there is a trace of what sustained the world in its beginnings. In every unsaid face, there is a life that silently contributed so that others could exist. The Genesis narrative, far from being just a record of the past, continues to resonate because it speaks of realities that repeat themselves. Families are formed, conflicts arise, paths diverge. And before each new generation, there remains the possibility of remembering what was forgotten, of giving voice to what was silenced, and of recognizing the importance of that which sustained life behind the scenes of history. What do we do with what we have received? How do we deal with the silences we have inherited, with the gaps that have been left to us? These questions still demand answers today. And perhaps it is in this process of searching, of listening attentively to what was left out, that we rediscover the thread that unites all beginnings with what is yet to come. Because not all truth is on the surface. Some lies in what has been omitted, in what has survived only in what remains alive within us. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.